A while back, I decided it was time for a snare upgrade. I've been playing a 13-inch metal snare for a while, but I really wanted to upgrade to a 14-inch just to have that in my arsenal also. So I went to a local music shop, one that happens to specialize in a lot of used and vintage gear actually, and checked out some other snares. There were a couple of specific snares I had in mind that day that I really wanted to get and I would have bought in a heartbeat if they'd had them. But they didn't have them because, again, they specialize in more used and more vintage gear. And so I wasn't able to find, I guess, the newer, more name brand kind of snare I was looking for. But the guy who was helping me out, he pulled out this PDP snare off the shelf and he said, "Hey, have you checked this one out?" And I realized I'd seen it kind of over in the corner, not really paid any attention to it because it was a PDP snare. But he pulls it out, hits it a couple times, and I thought, you know, that actually sounds pretty good. And so I grabbed it, I hit it a couple times, and I started messing around with the tuning on it, and I realized, you know what? This snare has a lot of potential. It's got a not so great throw off on it, but it's got the potential to sound exactly the way I want it to. It's a 14x6.5. I can tune it high, I can tune it low. Even though this drum was not in perfect condition, and even though the rods were a little bit stiff when I was tuning them, and even though the throw off kind of looked like it barely worked, and the snare wires were a little bit bent up, those were all things I knew I could upgrade and I could fix. So I went ahead and bought the snare and got to work making some upgrades. Naturally, the first thing I did was replace the heads and the snare wires. I actually used the snare for a gig that night, and so I switched those out first. So already here at the beginning of the video, you can see that I put different heads on it, and I put new snare wires on it. But to begin the refurbishment, I started by just taking the whole thing apart, taking all the screws out, taking the heads off, taking the lugs out, taking the throw off. I decided the first thing that needed to happen to at least make the snare feel and work a little more like a brand new snare, I needed to put some kind of oil onto the tension rods because they were very stiff. And when I would notice certain ones, as I'm trying to tighten them down, it would almost get stuck and it would be hard to get it tight. Meanwhile, it still needs to go tighter, and I wasn't able to get that side of the head exactly where I wanted it. So it was very difficult to achieve even tuning when the rods were kind of sticking in weird spots. So the first thing I did, I actually just took some Windex and wet a paper towel down and just wiped them off to get some of the old grease off. There are definitely better things I could have used to do a more thorough job on that, but there wasn't much on there and I knew it wasn't a big deal. So then I lined up all the screws on a paper towel, covered the top half of them with another paper towel, and sprayed on a layer of this stuff. I had read online in a lot of forums that some drummers were using this on tension rods and it worked really well. So I thought, let's give it a try. Turns out this stuff worked amazingly well, and it was a night and day difference in smoothness. Suddenly, as I was tightening the rods down, it felt like a brand new drum. Total smoothness, I was able to get it tuned much more evenly, much more easily. Another adjustment I was able to make, or another addition to those tension rods on my old 13-inch snare that I really wasn't going to use anymore at this point, I took a bunch of those little plastic rubbery washers off of the tension rods on that snare and put them onto these. Those are great because anything to reduce the metal on metal contact will just make tightening those down even smoother. So those two adjustments were a huge upgrade to the overall feel of getting this snare in tune and making it work. Now back to that throw off that I think was keeping people from buying this snare to begin with, even though it sounded great. Like I said, I used the snare at a gig that night right after I bought it, and I was having a lot of trouble with the throw off on there. It just completely turned off, just randomly. It flopped off and I had no snares in the middle of the song, so I'd flip it back on and it flopped off again. And so I knew, okay, this is not gonna work. So I thought, well, I only spent 150 bucks on this snare, and so why not spend another 50 on that really cool DW mag throw off that has the magnet thing and it's got the adjustable butt plate with the 3 settings. So I bought that and I thought, well, this is a PDP snare, this is a DW throw off and butt plate, so these ought to fit on here, you would think. Turns out they did not fit on there. The holes for where the throw-off mounts weren't big enough for the screws on the DW throw-off, and then the screw spacing on the butt plate was totally different. So I ended up having to drill new holes in the shell, which you can tell I've already done here. When I did that, I also had to take everything off of the shell and then use a drill press to drill the holes in from the outside of the shell inward. If you ever do that with the snare, just make sure to measure it many times so that you only have to drill once. But overall, that went pretty well, and it wasn't as big of a hassle as I was afraid it would be. So I was able to get the DW throw-off and butt plate on there, no problem, which was also a massive upgrade to the snare, which just made it feel much better. Knowing that I now had a throw-off on there I could trust, and I could get it to exactly the tension I wanted, That's a really cool throw off and it works great, I love it. So after that, I just threw everything back together, put all the lugs back on, put the heads back on, tightened everything back down, got everything tuned up, and took the snare over to the studio to do a sound check. As you guys know, I live in an apartment, so I can never actually record drums here at home. So I took it over to my friend's studio, True Sound Records. I'll provide a link to their stuff here in the description. And a big shout out to Stephen Wareham for engineering and producing this session. We had a lot of fun getting some cool drum sounds. So here you go, check out this $150 PDP snare that I think sounds just as good as any snare.